I'm Jim Hawley. I'm the head brewer here at the Twisted Hop Brewery in Christchurch, and we brew for the Twisted Hop Pub over in Woolston and the Laboratory down in Lincoln. And today we're making a Nakabolikov, which is a Russian Imperial Stout. It's a very, very dark beer. Jack upstairs has already ground the grain, crushed it actually, and it's feeding down through this masher, which injects the hot water into it, and it comes down into our mash tun, and it's fully hydrated. There's no dry malt left in the mixture, and I'll spread it out. This mash tun is essentially a large colander or sieve. It's got a false bottom so that the grain will be supported, and we can drain the liquid off the grain off the mash at a later point to send over to the kettle. So right now it's basically we've got 300 odd kilos of grain going in, and we're mixing it with water. It's about 66 degrees, and that is a temperature that will allow the starch to be liquefied out of the grain, and the natural enzymes in the malt will convert that starch into sugar. That sugar is what feeds the yeast in the fermentation process. So basically we're making 300 kilos of porridge right now, and we'll let it sit for about 40 minutes or so. This item here, the grain's coming down from the grist case here. This item through here is called a Steele's masher, and it's a very English piece of equipment. Usually people just drop grain down from a height and spray water in, sort of like a shower head treatment. This actually has an auger to drive the grain through, and it's got a series of water jets built into it, so it's spraying it from three sides. At the same time, out here in the clear part of the masher, you can see small steel fingers going around and around, and their job is to break up any clumps that may form. So it's a really interesting way of making sure that your grain gets totally wet. It's a fairly expensive piece of kit. I've been working for the Twisted Hop for a year and a half, and I've been essentially pursuing a full-time career in brewing since when I immigrated in 2009. Before I immigrated, I spent about 20 years home brewing out of the garage. Made an awful lot of beer that way. So that concludes the mashing in part. That's the first step in this whole biochemical chain. We're essentially converting starch in the grain into sugar. After about a 40-minute rest to make sure the conversion's complete, I'll start draining it from the bottom and run it back through the top. That takes advantage of a characteristic of the malt. Because it has a husk on it, it actually forms a filter bed. So when you start recirculating, at first you get a lot of small particles, and then they get captured in the top, and eventually towards the end you get very, very clear liquid coming out. So you're not carrying any of the grain over into the boil. That would be the recirculation phase. When it looks clear enough, I'll throw a couple of valves and we'll start transferring over to the kettle. And at the same time, we'll be taking more hot liquor, it's called the heated water, and spraying it on top of the grain. So the sugar solution is coming out of the bottom, hot water is coming in on the top, and it's basically rinsing the grain so you can extract all your sugars. So it's a very effective way of making sure that you get all that converted sugar out over into the kettle. And of course you'll be putting water in, so it's diluting what we call the wort at that time, going over into the kettle. When the kettle's full, we'll stop the transfer, drain the grain bed, and shovel the grain out. The boil kicks off in about 45 minutes to an hour after transfer, and at that point we'll add hops in. You usually put in hops right at the beginning of the boil. They're called your copper hops or bittering hops, and they're what give you that hop bite to the beer. This beer is an imperial stout. Stouts traditionally are very low hoppiness, so we won't be loading up the hops in this one at all. We boil for about an hour and a half. We sort of time it to adjust the final gravity. The gravity is essentially a measure of the density of the liquid, the percentage of sugar that you have in the water. So this is the cask room or the conditioning room. After we've had the beer ferment for a week, maybe a week and a half, depending on its strength, we'll actually rack off the bottom and fill these casks up. These are all 40 liters, so we'll get about 20, 24 out of a batch of beer. And the purpose of these is to allow a final fermentation. The finish of the fermentation brings the beer into condition. It will give you the carbonation levels that you need. The yeast will do its final mopping up. We also put hops into the cask. So those hops have never seen temperature, so they will not be bitter at all. They'll be there entirely for aroma or flavor. This is a rather unique thing. There's very few breweries in New Zealand doing what we call real ale. So this is the beer served out of the vessel it's conditioned in. And so that's why I say it's local. These do not travel well. They don't have a long shelf life. We haven't filtered, we haven't pasteurized. So they have yeast in there, they have hops in there. That's why real ale tends not to be as clear as your commercially available, what I call bright beers or keg beers, but they have a more subtle flavor, a more subtle aroma than those beers will. It's a very, very English way of doing things. And I think there's only 4, maybe 5 breweries in the entire country doing this, and you usually find their ales nearby. So this is the extent of our plans for world domination here. This is bright beer in tank. So it's been filtered out after a fermentation, it's been filtered and then force carbonated, and we can store it in these tanks for up to a few months probably before it starts going over the top. These are usually beers that are traditionally lagered, like Pilsner or Pacific Kolsch, are all cold conditioned. So they sit for literally months at 3 degrees C. And that's why Pilsners tend to be very, very clean tasting and very clear. All the yeast is dropped out of them, and then you filter them. So we have a few beers in here, but as you can see from the size, it's not our primary purpose in life. This is also where we store our hops. We get almost all of our hops are New Zealand hops. We do use the hops out of the Northwest America for accent on a couple of our beers. And the majority of our grain is all grown here in Canterbury. So once again, if we can locally source it and get the product that we desire, that's what we'll go for.